With anastrozole, all the neuroprotective benefits are wiped out. Without anastrozole, there's neuroprotective benefits. So what is the difference between aromatase being inhibited and aromatase not being inhibited? It's the estrogen level in the body. What's up, guys? Derek, moreplace.com. Today we're going to be talking about the neurotoxicity of certain anabolic steroids and how testosterone provides neuroprotection and these sort of myths that circulate in the community about why testosterone is, superior to other anabolics and what the point of a test-based. It all goes back to this test-based thing at the end of the day. So one thing that a lot of people don't realize is the neuroprotective component of testosterone is not the testosterone being some androgen that's unique from other steroids, in that it binds to receptors in the brain that provides neuroprotective benefits that other steroids don't. It's not like this. The reason why testosterone provides this neuroprotection is simply because it aromatizes at a rate that provides a sufficient amount of estradiol to balance out the androgen receptor activation. So the best way I can exemplify this is, first of all, before I delve into the study proving that estrogen is what protects the brain, not the testosterone itself, I just want to outline the cardiotoxicity and neurotoxicity of a lot of steroids are really, over exaggerated in my opinion, and it is not necessarily because these compounds are inherently way more dangerous than testosterone. I think it is more so that they don't have the same inherent mechanisms that testosterone does in an estrogen component context. So DHT derivatives are not substrates for aromatase. They don't aromatize into estrogen. So as you would probably know if you've seen my other content on estrogen, that the necessity for estrogen, physiologic estrogen levels in the body, is crucial for libido support. Contrary to popular belief, libido in men is actually supported mainly by estrogen, not by testosterone, although it's indirectly the testosterone, because you need a certain amount of androgens present, and it's the aromatization from the testosterone to the estrogen at the end of the day that mediates this estrogen being created in the first place. And that's the reason why you need a test base to begin with. Is if you don't have a sufficient amount of estrogen, you're going to have major issues with vasodilation, cardiotoxicity, you're going to have issues with neurotoxicity, you're going to have issues with bone mineral density loss, you're going to have issues with a myriad of things, and not even counting the downstream growth factors that come through the liver as a result of adequate estrogen levels. Like the most IGF-1 production, growth factor production, it all comes as a precursor via this having a sufficient estrogen level, essentially. Like the more estrogen present in concurrently with the androgens, the more growth factors the liver is going to produce to create this, hyper response to anabolics, essentially. So, there's a reason why it's not just like bulking compounds because they're wet and cause water retention. Sometimes it's that they actually mediate this increased estrogen level, which thereby increases the, production of these growth factors in the liver that eventually leads to actually a significantly greater amount of growth. And this is why most guys, the best, they'll notice the most they've ever grown is when their estrogen level is, the highest. This is, again, the test base. This is why there's a test base to begin with. Testosterone is actually on paper not tissue selective. It actually is very poor at building muscle relative to other compounds in terms of a nitrogen retention context. On paper, it's not superior to anything else really, but the thing is it aromatizes into estrogen at a rate that the body determines, it's like a very, very fixed system in place whereby testosterones are, bioidentical androgen that we produce naturally. So our body knows exactly how much estrogen to create from it, how much DHT to balance out the estrogen receptor activation, all these things that are, it's just like a perfect symphony of just, balancing act essentially of androgens to estrogen to, and the more estrogen essentially when it comes to hypertrophy at the end of the day, the better. And in this study in particular, like I mentioned, the neurotoxicity of androgens is largely mediated by lack of aromatization. So you have to consider when you look at data on X steroid, when they determine is this steroid worse than testosterone in a health capacity, it's often in a monotherapy context. So by that, it means they're using it on its own. They're not using testosterone with it. They're not using exogenous estrogen with it. If they're testing out, like trenbolone versus testosterone or nandrolone versus testosterone or something, they're using literally just like nandrolone on its own against testosterone on its own. So obviously, if you have a compound that doesn't aromatize sufficiently to estrogen and you're comparing it to the bioidentical hormone that our body literally is perfectly capable of aromatizing at the perfectly determined rate to balance out that testosterone and DHT in the body, which one's going to cause the cardio and neurotoxicity? It's going to be obviously the nandrolone that doesn't have a sufficient opposing amount of estrogen being aromatized via its presence. Like it activates estrogen receptor alpha a bit, and it is inherently estrogenic in some capacity, and it can raise estrogen a little bit, but it's, vastly lower than what it needs to be to provide sufficient neuroprotection. This is why in all the data you see on nandrolone, you'll often see how, bad it is for the heart, how bad it is for the brain, but it's because it's always used on its own. So if you shut down your natural testosterone production with an exogenous steroid, especially a 19-nor, which is like the most suppressive steroids there are, and you shut down your testosterone, you've effectively also shut down your estrogen production. So now you just have this nandrolone with an unopposed androgen with like no estrogen in your body wreaking havoc. Like there's no estrogen to provide the cardio and neuro support needed to balance out that androgen level. So this is why the drugs aren't necessarily worse. On their own, they're worse, but in the presence of sufficient estradiol, their, intense level of danger could potentially be, brought back up to a level where it's not that much worse than testosterone. At least that's what I theorize, and this is what I'm going to present this clinical data on, is you can actually see when you have testosterone administered to the subject at physiologic amounts with no aromatase inhibitor, it has neuroprotective benefits. So this is, what you'd expect. Testosterone on its own is neuroprotective, and then we see the doses of other steroids compared to it with the aromatase inhibitor. We see nandrolone as well as winstrol were addressed in this study, as well as another compound that is less notable because it's not really mainstream. But anyways, these compounds don't aromatize sufficiently into estrogen. So as you would expect, they were neurotoxic at every single dose, regardless if an aromatase inhibitor was used or not. But in the testosterone group, the only time testosterone was neurotoxic was if an aromatase inhibitor was used, or if the testosterone was used at, super physiological amounts. So what does this tell us? If an aromatase inhibitor negates the neuroprotective components of testosterone, but when the aromatase inhibitor isn't used, the testosterone shows blatant neuroprotective benefits, we can determine that it's not the testosterone itself that's some unique androgen that provides brain support. It's that the estrogen component, the aromatization of testosterone to estrogen, is what is supporting this neuroprotective effect. It's the fact that many things in the body are sort of mediated by this balance of estrogen to androgen. So if you have unopposed androgens, or if you have unopposed estrogen, I'm sure you've, seen all the cases of prostate cancer and how it basically boils down to an estrogen level, or an estrogen being unopposed by a sufficient amount of androgens. And this is why I theorize that DHT is probably, one of the best things to combat prostate cancer. And I know that sounds kind of crazy to people who think, wouldn't the most androgenic thing be the worst thing for prostate cancer? In reality, I think it's probably the lacking component of why the prostate cancer began to begin with. And this is why, in breast cancer, they use aromatase inhibitors to try and, block the cancer and destroy the cancer, because the estrogen being unopposed is what's cancerous. And the same thing can go for the androgens. If you have unopposed androgens, you're going to have significant amounts of neuro and cardiotoxicity. And this is where all the studies with showing nandrolone and its negative effects on the heart and the negative effects on the brain Don't get me wrong, these drugs are not going to be healthy for your brain or your heart at super physiologic dosages whatsoever. I'm just saying that a lot of the data is kind of inflated because of this lack of estrogen. And it's not necessarily the compound is more dangerous, it's that the compound with an absence of that sufficient estrogen is way more dangerous simply because it's an androgen with no estrogen to balance it out. So again, we get back to the testosterone, and with and without an aromatase inhibitor. So with an anastrozole, we see that the neuroprotective benefits of testosterone are completely wiped out. So for anyone who thinks testosterone is like this, unique androgen that binds to the AR in some special way that's going to protect the brain, whereby other steroids are just going to destroy your brain, I don't think it's as cut and dry as that. I think it's pretty, blatantly clear in the data. With an anastrozole, all the neuroprotective benefits are wiped out. Without an anastrozole, there's neuroprotective benefits. So what is the difference between aromatase being inhibited and aromatase not being inhibited? It's the estrogen level in the body. So if you have a sufficient amount of estradiol to balance out that testosterone, you get, a good stable level of what would be endogenous androgen production and aromatization and the balancing act of neuroprotection. But if you have a super physiologic level of testosterone relative to estrogen, or you have an anastrozole wiping out the estrogen to a point where you have way too much androgen relative to estrogen again, all the neurotoxicity starts spiking up. And that's this is literally seen right here. Like I don't think there's any argument in terms of what is being exemplified in the data here. And then when you look at nandrolone and winstrol, they're neurotoxic at every dose, regardless if an anastrozole is being used or not, because at the end of the day, there's not even a sufficient amount of estrogen to inhibit. Like there's no aromatase inhibition that's making a difference at the end of the day, because these compounds are not potent substrates for aromatase, and winstrol doesn't aromatize at all. Nandrolone can increase estrogen a little bit, but it doesn't provide a sufficient amount of estrogen at any dose, in my opinion. Like once you get into super physiologic territory, first of all, you're causing a significant amount of oxidative stress. You're causing the cardiotoxicity and neurotoxicity. But I can accept that the nandrolone is not as bad as it's, outlined to be in certain papers. But the problem is the answer is not to just dose the nandrolone so high that you can get a low normal estrogen level. Because at the end of the day, if you have a androgen level with like a gram of nandrolone, and you have a 15 picogram per milliliter estrogen level, that's the ratio of androgen to estrogen is so fucking far off that you're not fixing anything. Like it shows here, literally at every single dose, regardless, if an anastrozole is present, there's no difference whatsoever in neurotoxicity. And this just, blatantly shows that the nandrolone itself doesn't result in any level of appreciable estrogen aromatization to provide this neuroprotection that we need. And same with winstrol. So literally it goes back to, you need a test base when you're on a cycle, or you need something that converts to estrogen, or you need estrogen itself. It also shows that aromatase inhibitors are fucking shitty for you. If you don't need one, you would be well served, in my opinion, by doing whatever you can to avoid using aromatase inhibitors. And this is why, if you even need one in the first place, you're probably using too much testosterone to begin with, or you're too fat, or your diet sucks, or you're pitting way too infrequently, or a myriad of other issues, or you might have a genetic polymorphism whereby your sex hormone metabolism is subpar, unfortunately. But the likelihood that you would need an AI at a physiologic level of TRT, if everything was nailed down and you completely perfected your body composition, your diet, your administration frequency, your every single thing you could think of, the likelihood is extremely low. Even in genetically, unfortunate individuals, the likelihood is very low that you're going to need an aromatase inhibitor at a therapeutic level of TRT, in my opinion. I'm just going to read the conclusion of the study for you guys, just so you can get a very clear idea of what I'm talking about here. So a 4-day pre-treatment with nandrolone, winstrol, and gestrinone amplified excitotoxic death at low concentrations, and their action was insensitive to anastrozole. This is consistent with the evidence that nandrolone is weakly aromatized, whereas winstrol and gestrinone are not substrates for aromatase. Thus, the intrinsic toxicity of anabolic androgenic steroids was unopposed by estrogen formation in our cultures. Nandrolone amplified NMDA toxicity at lower concentrations than winstrol, which is consistent with its greater affinity at androgen receptors. Although nandrolone can be converted into the active androgen dihydronandrolone by 5-alpha reductase, this process had little relevance in our cultures if we take into account that nanomolar concentrations of nandrolone were more toxic than equimolar concentrations of testosterone plus aminoglutathamide, although dihydronandrolone has a lower affinity than dihydrotestosterone for androgen receptors. A difference between the 3 anabolic androgenic steroids and testosterone could also be observed when steroids were co-applied with NMDA during the excitotoxic pulse. Under these conditions, testosterone did not affect NMDA toxicity, whereas nandrolone, winstrol, and gestrinone retained their toxic activity, albeit with a lower potency. This suggests that even a single exposure to anabolic androgenic steroids may amplify excitotoxic death under pathological conditions. Taken together, our data offer the first evidence that anabolic androgenic steroids are toxic to neurons that are challenged with an excitotoxic insult. In principle, toxicity could result from a classic genomic mechanism mediated by androgen receptors, or alternatively by a neurosteroid-like mechanism which is independent of androgen receptors. Blah, blah, blah. Under these conditions, the abuse of anabolic androgenic steroids that are not aromatizable into estrogens might accelerate the rate of neuronal death. So the takeaway from that is essentially estrogen is needed, whether it comes from testosterone, whether it comes from whatever means your body has of getting it to physiologic levels. Fat loss, muscle growth, bone mineral density, IGF-1 production, all the growth factors that come downstream, in addition to neuroprotection, cardioprotection, libido. Like, these are all things that are mediated by sufficient amounts of estrogen. So people using aromatase inhibitors unnecessarily, or people who are using, you know, like DHT derivatives without a test base, or people that are just not using some way of getting their estrogen up with nandrolone only or something like that. There are a lot of ways in which you can put your body in a compromised position in a anabolic androgenic steroid cycle that not only inhibits your progress in a bodybuilding context, but severely compromises your health outcomes as well. So keep this in mind, and this is why whenever I do a experiment that doesn't involve testosterone, but involves something that's shutting me down, like nandrolone only or SARMs only or something, I use it in conjunction with exogenous estradiol. And now, obviously, I'm not suggesting you go do that. That's just what I'm doing. It's literally for this exact reason. Like, all these things that I just mentioned are mediated by estrogen and are critical not only for bodybuilding outcomes, but for health outcomes and just general physiologic functions and well-being. So take from that what you will. Thank you guys for watching. Please like, subscribe, check out my blog, moreplatesmoredates.com. Check me out on Instagram at moreplates_moredates, Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, etc. Subscribe to the newsletter, first link in the description down below. I highly recommend you subscribe to that because you will get emailed all the articles right when they go live when I publish them. The articles are essentially far more elaborate, as well as professionally presented versions of these videos with all the clinical studies I reference cited in them, so you can actually delve into it further yourself. Any clinical trials I reference, everything's broken down by subsections with a table of content, so you can actually just click on something and go read it through. And it's proofread elaborately by me, and basically it has me go through the video content and basically create a very polished version of the video in a very palatable, digestible format where it's easy to read. It's not, you know, me rambling, going back and forth between points. It's just straight up like subsection after subsection of very, very obvious, concise points with the elaborate details you need, but put into a format that's very easy to understand and absorb information-wise. And all the links to the clinical studies, as I mentioned, are in there at the appropriate spot, so you can go delve into it further yourself if you want to. So a lot of incentive to sign up for that, because you will not get those articles sent to you unless you sign up for that newsletter. So that's the link in the description below. Thank you guys for watching. Talk to you soon.